things that really matter most are going to church, being with your friends, knowing that other people take care of you, get hurt.
Like working on a project together.
So it's all the same stuff that you get in a secular community, but you need a community. That's kind of where they go with this. Anything that can give you a strong community will make you happier, regardless of whether it's religious.
Hi everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's talk. I'm John. I'm an activism chair of the Secular Student Alliance. SSA is the only organization on campus that's specifically geared towards non-religious students and supports separation of church and state. We put on community service events, social gatherings, and activism events such as this one. Our weekly discussion meetings are on Thursdays at 7 and 807 Denison. So if you like this talk, you should come join us at our next meeting on Thursday. Tonight's speaker is likely the only person in the room who has an asteroid named after her. So please help me in welcoming Rebecca Watson.
Hello. Does anybody else have an asteroid named after them? Yes. Thank goodness, because it would have been very awkward if you had. We would have had to redo that whole introduction. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm really excited to be here in Ann Arbor. This is my first time in Michigan, outside of the Detroit airport, which is lovely, but it's nice to see what else is out there. And thank you so much to Michigan SSA for having me out here. Definitely go check out their meetings. They're a really wonderful group of people. So my name is Rebecca Watson. I wasn't sure how many of you would know who I am or what I do. Some of you might have just wandered in off the street. So with that in mind, I thought I would start with a really quick introduction. I'm Rebecca Watson. You can find me on Twitter at Rebecca Watson. This is the sort of high quality content you can expect from me on a regular basis if you follow me. If you want better content, you can check out my website, which is called Skepchick, and it's located at skepchick.org. Skepchick it started out as a blog, now it is an entire network of blogs, and we talk about a variety of topics: science, critical thinking, feminism, social justice, secularism, religion, whatever we want to talk about, but those are our main topics. We have since launched a number of sister sites covering a wide variety of topics and focusing more on those topics on each site. So we have a site for the intersection of art and science, Mad Art Lab. We have a teen version of Skepchick, which is basically Skepchick without the profanity. We have Queerica, which is LGBTQ issues and science and skepticism. School of Doubt for teachers of all levels, how to teach critical thinking in schools. Grounded Parents for parents who want to raise rational kids. And we also have Spanish, Norwegian, and Swedish versions of the site now. So we are taking over the world, one country at a time. I also have a podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. We're one of the top podcasts on iTunes. And again, we cover similar topics, but a bit more focused on science and critical thinking, skepticism. We have a variety of guests on the show. We have about 120,000 listeners a week. And our guests have included people like Jimmy Carter, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and just last night, Spike from Angel and Buffy. So if any of you have any questions about what it's like to talk to James Marsters, I'm happy to answer those after the talk. He was wonderful. So for those of you who don't know what skepticism is about, I wanted to give you a quick introduction to that. Basically, skeptics critically examine the world around us using the scientific method. It's a friend of mine described it as one side science communication and another side compassion and protecting people from being defrauded. So we cover things like psychics and conspiracy theories, Bigfoot, big topic, lots of fun. I love Bigfoot. Global warming denial is another, people who misunderstand the science, people who purposefully spin the science to suit their needs. Free energy machines is the sort of physics side of skepticism, looking at how we can get free energy. We can. Vaccine denial is a huge thing that we cover. People like Jenny McCarthy spread the idea that vaccines cause autism. There's no scientific evidence to back that up. So one of the things we do is teach parents the actual science behind vaccines and encourage them to vaccinate their kids. Ghosts, another fun topic, not quite as heavy as vaccine denial, but lots of fun. Creationism is a huge one. Creationism in schools, people who are trying to teach the controversy in public schools is a huge issue among skeptics, and there are several organizations that lobby quite hard for the government to protect the separation of church and state and keep creationism out of our public schools, and a variety of other assorted pseudoscience. Basically what I do is I cover a lot of those topics in a number of different venues, but one of the things that I really like to do when I'm going around and giving talks is I like to talk about where skepticism can impact social justice, how skepticism can help social justice movements be better and more effective, and how the collection we have of skeptics and secularists, people who are concerned about separation of church and state, how they can join together, particularly right now with feminists, in order to make the world a better place. And that is what this topic is about. And just so you're aware, a bit of a trigger warning, I am going to be talking occasionally about rape. I will try to not be overly graphic, but that is a topic that will come up. There are babies in the room, I notice, but hopefully if I say anything horrible, they won't understand what I'm saying, or it's your fault, really. So that's why I'm talking about the religious right tonight. You might recognize this guy, Todd Akin, a Republican from Missouri, who in August of 2012, he attracted quite a bit of attention online when he said, "From what I understand from doctors, it," meaning pregnancy from rape, "is really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down." So what he was basically saying is that women who get pregnant as the result of being raped likely weren't really raped. An analogous situation would be a politician saying something along the lines of, "As I understand scientists, we aren't related to monkeys." You know, it's something completely out of left field. It's factually incorrect. There's this veneer of science being used to support it, and it's long been debunked. Akin eventually said that he misspoke, but once you look at the evidence, it becomes pretty clear that he said exactly what he meant to say. There are 32,000 approximately rape-related pregnancies per year in the US, so nobody really knows exactly what image of the female reproductive system was in Akin's mind when he misspoke. This is one of my favorite things to come off of Twitter at that time, showing an image. Actually, I should ask, is anyone sight impaired? Because if so, I do more to describe each slide. But so
Can you please describe that?
Yeah. Okay. So here we have the female reproductive system labeled with rape countermeasures and waiting area, legitimacy detector, romance area. So yeah, what was Akin talking about then when he suggested that rape-related pregnancies were rare? Was this just him misspeaking? Well, when we look at the evidence, it becomes pretty clear that he wasn't misspeaking, because this is a common thing that we hear over and over and over again from a particular type of person. So this came from John C. Wilkie in 1999. When pro-lifers speak of rape pregnancies, we should commonly use the phrase forcible rape or assault rape, for that specifies what we're talking about. Rape can also be statutory. Depending upon your state law, statutory rape can be consensual, but we're not addressing that here. Assault rape pregnancies are extremely rare. In 1995, we have North Carolina State Representative Henry Aldridge saying, "The facts show that people who are raped, who are truly raped, the juices don't flow, the body functions don't work, and they don't get pregnant." Medical authorities agree that this is a rarity, if ever. 1988, in the Philadelphia Daily News, they reported that State Representative Stephen Freend said, "The odds that a woman who is raped will get pregnant are 1 in millions and millions and millions." The reason, he said, is that the traumatic experience of rape causes a woman to secrete a certain secretion that tends to kill sperm.
It's very scientific.
1980, attorney James Leon Holmes said, "Concern for rape victims is a red herring because conceptions from rape occur with approximately the same frequency as snowfall in Miami." So now we're already back in 1980. I think you can see that this is a pretty common talking point from, mostly Republicans. But it actually goes back even further than that. Samuel Farr in 1785, in the first English language medical text on record, wrote, "Without an excitation of lust or enjoyment in the venereal act, no conception can probably take place." 1785 is when this supposedly began. It probably went back a bit further, but this is the first time we have it written down. And the theory here, the scientific theory, is that men have to orgasm in order to release sperm, and men and women have essentially the same systems, but with women's inside. That was basically the thinking at the time, that women had the exact same reproductive system as men, it was just sort of inverted. And so they decided that a woman could not actually get pregnant unless she also orgasmed. Now, at first blush, you might think that is a great misconception to have. Because ideally, if you have a couple who really want to get pregnant and that is their belief system, he's going to try super hard to make sure they're going to have that baby. So she is probably getting a good deal. The problem, of course, is when we look at rape victims. Rape victims get pregnant. They are accused of having wanted it, because surely they could not get pregnant if they hadn't have orgasmed. And by orgasming, that must mean that they consented to what happened to them. So that is the unfortunate dark side of this, this quote-unquote theory that has been long debunked. So does this sound familiar to anyone? It's an idiotic theory based on primitive scientific thought, passed along by mostly Christian fundamentalists that Republicans then try to inject into government. It is basically very analogous to creationism and evolution, something that skeptics and secularists often fight very hard for. And that's one of the reasons why I like talking about this topic, because I think that I really want secularists to be as passionate about fighting for women's rights as they are about keeping creationism out of schools. And when you see all of the parallels, it becomes really obvious, I think. To get back to Aiken briefly, he has long been a rape skeptic, I guess we'll call him. This is something he said in 2008. "We have terrorists called abortionists, giving abortions to women who are not actually pregnant. All of these things are common practice. There's ample evidence that abortion doctors on any number of occasions have deceived women into thinking that they're pregnant and then collect money for a procedure that they don't perform." So again, we have a statement that seems to come out of nowhere. Where did he get this idea that abortion providers are giving abortions to women who aren't actually pregnant? And again, we can look back through our history and we can see the same talking point repeated over and over and over again by the religious right. This is Wendy Wright. She is the president of, I was about to say Concerned Women of America. I want to make sure I get her ridiculous nonprofit correct. Maybe it does concern women of America. It's somewhere in my notes, and I will get to it eventually, I'm sure. Wendy Wright is best known to skeptics as the wacky lady who pushed creationism in a Richard Dawkins film. I think it was The Root of All Evil. And she did a very poor job of representing the creationist argument, and Dawkins basically made her look like an idiot. But her organization is actually more focused on preventing women from accessing basic health care, birth control, abortion, and basic equality, human rights for women. So this is something that she said. Numerous reports from investigative journalists, state inspectors, and abortion providers have revealed abortionists who routinely committed abortions on women who were not pregnant. Back in the 80s, we have Carol Everett, who was an ex-clinic worker who constantly did the rounds on Pat Robertson's radio stations and TV shows, saying there are women who came in and had abortions but weren't pregnant. Her ex-clinic workers said that she was making it all up, but the religious right did not care. She did a speaking circuit, and she spread this far and wide. So where are they getting this from? It actually comes originally from the 70s, when a journalist went undercover in Philadelphia into some of the seedier abortion clinics and found that there were a lot of horrible practices happening in these clinics. And as a result of the report they filed, a lot of those clinics, several of the clinics, were shut down. And one of the things was several cases of women getting D&Cs who weren't actually pregnant. That was in the 70s, a few cases, and before pregnancy tests were in every corner pharmacy. So that report has been spun into something that is supposedly a common practice performed all over, and a reason why abortion clinics should be shut down. It's even made its way into legislation. Right here in Michigan, HB 4446, there's anecdotal testimony to suggest that women, in some circumstances, have been given an abortion where there was no pregnancy. Requiring an ultrasound will give additional verification that the woman is pregnant and protect the health of a woman by ensuring she is not given an unnecessary procedure. So that became the basis for a lot of these really horrific ultrasound bills that you have. And I will be talking about those in a little bit. So who am I talking about when I talk about the religious right? I want to be really clear here that I'm not talking about just conservatives, and I'm not talking about just theists. I'm talking about the place where those two things intersect. Theists who are conservatives who want their religion pushed into government. This is where the assholes are. So you can be religious, you can be conservative, but when those two things combine, we have what we call the religious right. The religious right is made up of a number of individuals and also corporations. It's important to understand that these organizations are representing a minority of the United States. Most people in the United States are not a part of the religious right. But to make up for that, they have a vast amount of wealth. Focus on the Family alone has a $109 million budget. Oh, and it was Concerned Women for America. I should have known. Wendy Wright is so concerned. She was running that when she did the interview with Dawkins. So yeah, you can see how much money these guys are making, and these are the organizations that are lobbying the government to push for laws, to push for legislation that will directly impact women's health. Yes, some of these same organizations are behind creationism bills, but for the most part, and also I should mention, a number of them are behind a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation, anti-equality legislation, anti-same-sex marriage legislation. These are all the same people. But for a lot of them, for the last few years particularly, their focus has been on women, on preventing women from accessing birth control, and particularly from preventing them from accessing abortion. So there are a lot of things that have been happening in the past few years, and there is absolutely no way I can go through them all. I've given this talk a few times, and over the past 3 or 4 years, and it's completely different every time, because every time I go to give the talk, there's a new crop of horror to choose from. So I'm just going to go over a few of the, we'll call them highlights, for lack of a better word, lowlights. We'll call them lowlights of what the religious right has been up to. Basically, the main goal, I should say one of their primary tactics is to introduce bills at the federal level that they know will fail. And those inspire dozens of copycat bills that are then pushed through state legislature. So all of the attention that things get at the federal level, it drops off remarkably so at the state level. Very few people seem to be paying attention these days to what their state representatives are doing. And this allows the religious right, again, a minority, to lobby senators into pushing their legislation. So one of those things is fetal pain. This is something that was introduced at the federal level and was not passed, and was quickly introduced in over 20 states and passed in a number of them. It's based on the idea that scientists have discovered that fetuses begin to feel pain at 20 weeks, and therefore we should outlaw abortion at that point. You might be wondering if that is unconstitutional, considering Roe v. Wade. You would probably be correct, but that is an ongoing problem. A lot of these laws are currently wrapped up in the court systems. A number of them, though, have gone into effect while people are battling them. So just for the record, there is no scientific consensus that says when a fetus can feel pain, but there is a consensus that says they probably can't feel pain at 20 weeks. It's far too early in their development. This does not stop the religious right from pushing this forward, because it helps them in preventing a number of abortions. And as you'll see, when combined with many of their other measures that are designed to force women to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop till the point that they hit 20 weeks and then they can't get an abortion at all, it all plays together quite evilly. Another common piece of legislation is based on protecting women's mental health. In South Dakota, before a woman can get an abortion, she must be counseled by a doctor on the suicide risks of getting an abortion. Research has shown again and again and again that there is no elevated risk for getting an abortion when it comes to suicide risk. The elevated risk is from unwanted pregnancies, period. There's no difference in the number of suicides or the number of cases of depression between women who have abortions and women who go ahead and carry the pregnancy to term. However, despite the fact that doctors testified against this, the law was passed and the court upheld it. So that is still a law in South Dakota. There are also laws that are supposedly there to protect women's physical health. In New Hampshire, they introduced a bill saying that doctors had to counsel a woman that she had an increased chance of getting breast cancer if she got an abortion. This one was particularly bad. As it was originally introduced, the law would require doctors to tell women that they stood an increased chance of breast cancer with abortion. And if the doctor did not tell the woman that, or if the doctor lost the paperwork proving that they had told a woman that, the doctor could face jail time. There is no link between breast cancer and abortion. Again, study after study after study has shown this. The American Cancer Society, amongst others, testified that there was no link. And luckily, there was enough of an uproar about this one that it did not pass. But I think you can probably expect to see it in other states in the coming years. So there are so many cases, and there's so many different pieces of legislation that, again, are introduced in one place and then copycatted elsewhere, that I really just could not go into all of them. And it's so bad. Women are getting screwed over so badly recently that I actually almost forgot about personally you, Michigan's quote-unquote rape insurance law that just went into effect. Our hosts reminded me of this one, so I thought I would throw it in, just in case you weren't aware. And the slang term for this bill is misleading. It's not just rape insurance. Basically, it forces women to buy an extra bit of insurance if they want abortions covered, whether it's for the case of rape or not. And if a woman doesn't have insurance provided by an employer, then she cannot get insurance at all in the case of abortion. And also, there's the whole Hobby Lobby shit that's going down. And this is a whole other can of worms that unfortunately I just don't have time to go into tonight, but it's insane and quite scary. But instead I wanted to focus on one case study of sorts. I wanted to talk about Texas and what a horrible hellhole Texas is becoming. Earlier I mentioned ultrasound bills. Texas was one of the first to pass an ultrasound bill. And this requires a woman, before she has an abortion, she has to have an ultrasound at least 24 hours before going back to actually get the abortion. And a lot of people at the time misunderstood. When they think of an ultrasound, they think of the little paddles and the gel, and you put it on your tummy and you see an image. That's not, unfortunately, the way to do an ultrasound very early on in a pregnancy. Instead, you need to do an intravaginal ultrasound. And the next image is a little graphic. It is a cartoon, but it is a bit graphic, just so you're aware. This is what an ultrasound actually looks like. And so this is now required in Texas for any woman who wants an abortion. And just imagine for a second a woman who is getting an abortion because she was raped, and then she has to go through this as a matter of course to protect her because maybe she's not really pregnant, despite the fact that she's taken pregnancy tests, that the doctor has assured her she's pregnant. This is an extra step that Texas threw on just to cause additional discomfort. And not just the discomfort of getting the ultrasound, which is bad enough and which could dissuade someone who had been raped from even going through with it, but also the additional effort of needing to go to see the doctor twice, which at first might not seem like a huge deal. You go to the doctor once, the next day you go back. But what if there's no abortion clinic in your town? What if you need to travel, say, 3 hours away to go to an abortion clinic? Then it becomes a big deal, especially if you have an hourly job that you can't afford to leave. It immediately doubles your costs. You need to get a hotel room. Now it's become a whole abortion vacation. So it's actually been, it was quite an efficient way for Texas to turn women away from abortions. But they weren't finished yet. So this is back in 2011 that passed. And also in 2011, they decided to defund Planned Parenthood, which was providing a great number of health services to poor and disenfranchised women in Texas. And by doing this, the politicians sold this to their constituents as a sort of cost-cutting measure at the same time as preventing abortions from happening. And instead, it ended up costing the state millions of dollars because the state then had to take on the effort of giving all of these poor women health care, whereas before, the federal government was covering the cost. And so millions of women would be left without any actual access to health care because Texas didn't have the money or the resources to provide the cancer screenings, the basic health care that Planned Parenthood was providing. So that went through in 2011, and you can see in just a couple of years the number of women who were being served through Texas family planning and women's health programs went from 350,000 in 2011 down to just a tad more than 150,000 in 2013. So that's 200,000 women who went without health care in 2013 who could have gotten it in 2011. This is courtesy of Mother Jones, by the way. They did a really great expose of what went down in Texas. And they also found that after those budget cuts, 39 of the 53 clinics that had to shut down were not Planned Parenthood. 14 were, but none of them actually provided abortions. So Texas basically just blocked women from basic health care without actually achieving their goal of stopping funding abortions, which is how they sold this to constituents. So they decided to up their game. I assume that the politicians of Texas saw that they did not do a great job of shutting down abortion providers. So this past year, they went over the top, and that was with Senate Bill 5, which you're probably at least a little bit familiar with. Now, when this was introduced, the majority of Texas voters specifically did not want abortion brought up in these special legislative sessions that Texas was having. But their opinion did not matter. Again, we're talking about a minority of people with a lot of money and a lot of control in the government. That's what the religious right is good at. So despite the opinion of a majority of Texas voters, they moved forward with Senate Bill 5. And what Senate Bill 5 included was a number of things that were focused on shutting down those additional abortion clinics. For instance, by October 29th of 2013, if the bill went through, no one would be able to get an abortion over 20 weeks. So we have that fetal pain bill finally coming into play in Texas. And if they wanted a medical abortion, as opposed to a surgical abortion, so meaning the type of abortion where you just need to take 2 pills and then generally go home and have your abortion, that would require up to 4 visits with the same doctor. 1 to get the ultrasound, 1 for visit 1, and then you had to go back to get the second pill, which was a new addition. Normally you could just take that at home. But they insisted with this bill that the pill must be taken in the presence of a doctor. And then again for a follow-up several weeks later. By November 1st, all abortion doctors in Texas would need to have admitting privileges at a hospital. That alone would shut down 1/3 of all of the abortion clinics. There is no evidence to suggest that a woman's abortion doctor, if something goes wrong with her abortion, that doctor needs to then tend to her at the hospital. There's nothing to suggest that that's the case. But it doesn't matter. Under the guise of protecting women, they decided that abortion doctors must have admitting privileges. Never mind that there are hospitals that wouldn't let a local abortion provider have admitting privileges simply because they provide abortions, and the hospital is, say, a Catholic hospital that objects to abortions. So it's a very convenient new law. By the end of November, 155,000 women lost access to health care because of this. So I should mention that, quickly, sorry, to get back to the actual dangers of those medical abortions, I wanted to mention this. According to the Centers for Disease Control, they do an abortion surveillance for the United States every year. And so for 2010, the most recent one available, They said that the national legal induced abortion case fatality rate for 2003 to 2009 was 0.67 legal induced abortion-related deaths per 100,000 reported legal abortions. So in other words, your chances of dying from a medical abortion were about 1 in 150,000. And to put that into perspective, your chances of dying in a car accident are about 1 in 5,000. So if we're talking about the best way to protect women's lives, then really you should insist that a doctor be present for any time you go driving. That would probably prevent a lot more deaths. But again, they don't really care about the risk. They don't actually care about the risk to women's lives. The point of this was to prevent access to abortion. And the reason why you might have heard of this bill was because of Wendy Davis, who decided that she was not going to put up with it and that she would filibuster the bill in order to prevent it from going through. She attracted a huge online swelling of support, and on the ground in Austin, thousands of people showed up to support her as she filibustered the bill. You can see this is a view of the Texas legislature that night. It was all over Twitter, if you were following it. It was like as exciting as watching the Super Bowl. You know, it was really moving and powerful to see one woman standing up against these bills that were being pushed through against the majority of Texans' desires. There were even hooligans arrested, as you can see. And of course, the mainstream media was all over it at the time. This is literally what was on CNN at the same time that this was happening in the Texas legislature. It was Piers Morgan talking about blueberry muffins. But we succeeded. The bill did not pass because of the filibuster. For a few brief moments, there was an outcry of joy. You know, we can do this. We won the battle. Unfortunately, the war was not over. Rick Perry called a second session immediately. So within a few weeks, he had pushed the bill through anyway and signed it into law. So this happened just this week. Basically, Planned Parenthood has been fighting this bill as hard as they could because it would shut down so many clinics. They experienced, again, a brief win when a court determined that they were right, that this bill was only meant to prevent women's access to abortion. And so that was then taken to an appeals court. And just this week, the appeals court overturned that decision and determined that the law did, in fact, protect women's health. Again, despite all of the science that was presented, all of the science that says that abortions are safe and effective, and that all of these new regulations would do nothing more than make abortions more difficult for women to obtain, the courts still determined that. So like I said, because of this bill, by the end of November, there were 155,000 women who had lost access to health care. State officials reported a 77% reduction in the number of women who were receiving birth control, life-saving cancer screenings, and well woman exams. So that was a great job. And the thing is, with this appeals court, the Supreme Court is now going to consider this, and what the Supreme Court determines will have ramifications on the rest of the United States. So to get back to my evolution creationism analogy, a lot of secularists know about the fight in Texas to make better science textbooks, because a few years ago, Texas was considering putting creationism into their science textbooks. The textbook creators tend to base their decisions on what happens in Texas because there are so many books printed there that they end up affecting the rest of the country. So once again, just like with creationism, we have an issue that is based on primitive thought, passed along by Christian fundamentalists. Republicans are injecting into the government, and now Texas is becoming this battleground that is going to have ramifications for the rest of the United States. So let's talk briefly about the actual science of abortion. How do we reduce abortions if that is our goal? Well, one way to do that, the science shows, is to hand out free birth control. In Texas, they found that a significant portion of women in the past few years who were going to get abortions were unable to access their preferred birth control of choice leading up to the unwanted pregnancy. That's not a coincidence. If you educate people on how to use contraception, and if you give them easy access to that contraception, you reduce the total number of unwanted pregnancies and you reduce the total number of abortions. A study in 1996 looked at whether or not restrictions on abortion in a certain state would actually reduce the total number of abortions that were being had. And what they found was very interesting. They looked at restrictions on Medicaid funding for abortion, and they found that it did lower the number of abortions in the states that put these restrictions in place, but it had a corresponding increase in the rates of abortions in the surrounding states. So in other words, women were still getting abortions, they were just going elsewhere to get them. This supports a later study by the Guttmacher Institute that looked at abortion restrictions on a country-by-country basis. And what they found was that by and large, banning abortion or placing restrictions on getting abortion didn't reduce abortion. Wealthy women who could afford to go to other countries to get their abortions would do that, while poor women would resort to illegal abortions. And these illegal abortions, of course, are incredibly unsafe. And so banning abortion ended up not reducing the total number of abortions, but it did increase the number of women who were dying unnecessarily. And the religious right knows that. In Mississippi, they passed some restrictions that closed down a number of clinics. And this is Bubba Carpenter, GOP state senator, who literally said, let the women use coat hangers. He admitted that he knows that women are still going to go out and get abortions despite the fact that he has effectively barred them from getting safe and legal abortions, and that they're just going to go out and have horribly dangerous abortions that are only going to end up killing them. And he was quite joyful about it because that's what they want. They are there to control women's sexuality. They don't actually care if women are dying because of these laws. And so we have, even in the secular movement, in the secular community, we have people who claim to be quote unquote pro-life, which is a term that I generally try to avoid because everybody is pro-life. To be more specific, they're anti-abortion. And they claim to all be atheists, secularists, so they don't identify as part of the religious right, but they do believe that abortion should be outlawed. So they present a lot of arguments to support the idea that, for instance, an embryo should have the equivalent rights of a fully developed human, that women should be forced to carry them to term. And that's a philosophical debate that you're welcome to have on your own. But when we look at the science, none of that really matters, because we're not talking about whether or not embryos should be killed. When we look at the science that shows us that outlawing abortion doesn't stop embryos from being killed, it only increases the number of women who are being killed. So I want you guys to go away from this understanding that there are people who will constantly try to push the argument into this territory of whether or not an embryo has rights. But what I think is important is to refocus the argument on the fact that women have rights, and that anti-abortion laws and restrictions are taking away those rights and taking away those lives. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't know even how. Let's see, it's 8:30. So we have plenty of time for Q&A, I think, right? Are we good on time? Yeah. So we do have time for Q&A. I'll just end by encouraging you all to please vote. I mentioned a few of the things that are happening here in Michigan. Your representatives, especially on the state level, they need to know who you are and they need to know what you believe. So many people don't pay attention to what's happening on the state level. There are very few people, I think, who could even name their representatives in the state legislature. So please find out who they are and then call them and tell them exactly how you feel about them being in the pocket of the religious right. And you can check out places like Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood has been so great and so integral at pushing for the fight to protect women's lives and women's rights. So you can donate to them or at least get on their mailing list and they will tell you when there are action alerts, things you can do. RH Reality Check is a really great website that collects a lot of the issues surrounding abortion and contraception. And of course you should check out Skeptic, my own website, because we cover this stuff as well, particularly when it veers into the path of pseudoscience, and we attempt to debunk that, to explain it, to make sure that our politicians are usually basing their decisions on actual science and not religious beliefs. So that's all I got. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think we have like microphones there and there if you guys want to talk about anything else. I think that there will also be bar hopping after this, during which we can also chat. But if there aren't any questions.
Well, I guess my biggest concern is, as a member of the scientific community, I don't know the best way to react to get people to understand that when one of these, Republicans says something that's blatantly false, how do we make sure everyone realizes that this is false and that's not okay to make these false claims?
If you couldn't hear that, he's asking, how do you, as a member of the science community, how do you help explain that these politicians are making false claims? I think one of the best ways you can do that is by paying attention to what the groups like Planned Parenthood are doing, because often they will have campaigns that can always use a boost. So even something as simple as retweeting things and sharing things on Facebook when they have letter writing campaigns can be a huge help. And as a member of the science community, I would just really encourage you to engage with other scientists in this discussion, because I think that there are a lot of people working in the sciences who care very deeply about how science is represented in the general public, but shy away from things that they consider too political. We often get, as in my podcast, we occasionally talk about global warming, and inevitably we will get an angry email from someone telling us to stop politicizing science. And our response is generally, we're not politicizing science. The science has already been politicized. And this is the arena where it's become most important, because this is where actual decisions are being made and people's lives will be affected. So the more people from the science community, one of the reasons why I like talking about this, mostly to skeptical and secular groups, is because I think that when we've got the skeptics and the science communicators joining together with the feminists, I think it creates a better force to be reckoned with, I'd recommend all of those things, and also subscribing to feminist blogs and things like that, because I sometimes find my favorite feminist sites will sometimes get the science wrong on things, and I think that does us a disservice. So when there are scientists who are not being, not picking a fight with them, who aren't anti-feminist, but who are on their side, but who can say, actually, you know, we had a joke earlier about how actually is how every sentence starts when you're a skeptic, but actually, you know, this is the science. And to give you a really brief example of that, a few years back, there in the US, there was a federal panel convened to determine whether or not 40 was the best age for women to begin getting breast cancer screenings, to get mammograms. And this panel determined that it was not, that it created a lot of false positives, and that women were best served by waiting until 50 in general, unless you have other risk factors. And what was great was that I saw a feminist website that I followed report on this, and they were very angry about it. And they said, oh, it's just some men who are, you know, preaching from on high and saying that the poor women can't handle a false positive here and there, and you know, and they were basically misrepresenting the entire thing. But in the comments, there were a bunch of people, including cancer researchers, who were saying, oh no, actually the panel was 3 men and 3 women, and you know, this is why false positives are so dangerous, and you know, pushing the age back doesn't cause a noticeable increase in deaths. So it was great to see that sort of myth busting come in. And then at the same time, over on another feminist website, I saw them actually bring up a point that I didn't see addressed on any of the skeptic sites that were covering this. People like Orac, for instance, is a great example. He has a super blog, and he's a cancer researcher. And so he covered this topic very well. But it was on a feminist website that I saw something that I hadn't seen covered before, which was the fact that Black women tend to experience a much more aggressive form of breast cancer that comes on much earlier. So when the panel suggested moving back the age, they were making that suggestion for the average woman, but they failed to say that the average woman was white. And so it was a feminist site that actually pointed this out and said, you know, we need to consider Black women as well because they have a different experience that scientifically needs to be addressed. So, you know, I thought it was a really good coming together of these two groups where everybody can learn from each other, and I think that that's the best possible result. This is a really, really long-winded answer, I'm sorry. But yeah, basically just helping raise awareness to the groups that are fighting for these causes is the absolute best thing you can do, I think. Any other?
I know we already have...
That's not on, so
that
I
is
think
definitely
you just
not
need
on,
to
no.
Either turn it on or speak up.
Hello? Nope. Okay, anyway. So we already know that when you're talking with somebody and they say, oh, vaccines cause autism, you can say no and give your reasons, but that's not really going to convince them. You have to give them evidence and give them things that will turn them around. And when you're having a conversation about abortion and women's rights in this kind of way, we don't really, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of any clearinghouse like What's the Harm, where I can pull up like, okay, this is what the harm is, these are the facts, these are the studies. Is there some sort of a clearinghouse for this kind of information on this war on women?
That's a good question. He's asking if there's a clearinghouse for this kind of information to present to people. I think there are several good resources. RH Reality Check is a very good one when it comes to this stuff. There's also, what's it called? Right Wing Watch, do you know? Right. Yeah, it's like Religious Right Watch or something.
Rightwingwatch.org.
Yeah, rightwingwatch.org. Okay, yeah. They have detailed breakdowns of the different players in the religious right, which I find really helpful. There's also bloggers you can follow, like Amanda Marcotte. The Guttmacher Institute is probably the best website for finding studies showing, like the Guttmacher Institute is the one that was behind the study showing that outlawing abortion doesn't decrease the number of abortions. They're actually an arm of Planned Parenthood, and you can go to their website and you can find really well-written and simple and easy to understand studies to pass along to people. So those are the best resources I can think. Does anybody, you look like, do you have something? Yes? No? Oh. You look like you were about to say something.
No.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
If anybody else has any other resources they like, feel free to shout them out. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of places to find this stuff. I wouldn't say that there's just one, but they're mostly feminist organizations and sites. Planned Parenthood probably being the biggest umbrella for all that stuff. And yeah, you know, when you talk about convincing someone and showing them the evidence to convince them, it's important to remember that evidence is great, but it doesn't convince people usually. A lot of people base these decisions on emotion, and that's why I kind of like I really like that study showing that outlawing abortion doesn't stop abortion, because it does an end around. Is that a word? End around? It's a football thing. It gets around their biases and preconceptions. It takes it from another angle that maybe they didn't think about before. So I think that anytime you can find a way to approach such a sensitive topic like abortion, it's something that people have really passionate beliefs about, though they might not have fully examined those beliefs. Anytime you can find a way to come at it from another angle, I think is a good thing. And also to remember that you're never going to convince someone in the moment. When you are in the middle of a fight, you're never going to convince them. The absolute best thing you can do is to give them those resources and walk away and wait like 10 years. I know, I'm impatient too. But, you know, we talk about it on SU a lot, actually, about planting the seed. Because, and this is certainly a personal thing for me, no one has ever convinced me of anything. Every decision I've ever come to has been entirely on my own, or so I think. My friend Bug Girl could probably contest that, because when we first met, I had no idea what feminism was, and she slapped me around quite a bit in the early days. But I think the way she did it was perfect. It was as a friend, and to say, maybe you should consider this, and then just here's some evidence and a beer. You know, walking away and leaving me to stew, and that's what happens. You know, somebody you leave them with a little nugget to roll around in their brain, and eventually they forget that you ever put it there, and it becomes their own opinion, and that's probably the best way to ultimately convince somebody of anything.
So I hate to be like super pessimistic right now, but voting is obviously like the number one thing you should do to change anything. But with like the Supreme Court decision that happened yesterday with McCutcheon, you know, essentially our democracy is turning into an oligarchy, where you're talking about these small minority of people that have lots of money controlling a lot of our government.
Yeah.
So, and media, yeah. And so getting involved is becoming increasingly harder. You know, they're killing unions. So any type of activism is getting extremely difficult. And I guess I'm gonna speak a blanket statement for all students, but with tuition prices being so high now, we can't just like take a semester off to go be activists,
Right.
you know? Like that's just not a reality.
Yeah.
So it's like, besides voting, which is sort of rigged by gerrymandering anyway, what can us pessimists do?
I hate to say this, but I wouldn't call you a pessimist. I would call you a realist. No, it's a very good question. Give up and move to Canada. Yes. No, yeah, you're right. You're referring to the Supreme Court decision that basically reduces the restrictions placed on how much money you can give to a politician, and every time that's done, it's abused. So yeah, that was a really depressing ruling, and I don't blame you for being pessimistic about it. And you know, and I think it's a good point that it's not just the political system that's stacked, it's the media, it's the mainstream media. I showed you what CNN was doing while all of Austin erupted. But the good news, and there is a little, is that the mainstream media becomes less and less effective on a daily basis. They become less and less relevant on a daily basis. And Twitter and Facebook and YouTube become more, well, maybe not YouTube, become more and more. What was that?
Just don't read the comments.
Don't read the comments, never read the comments. But yeah, social media becomes a bigger and bigger deal. And I think that the more we talk about these things, and you know, and I'll be the first to say that there is an echo chamber online and it can be deceiving. You know, before any election, there's always like, this is it, you guys, we're gonna do it. Everybody thinks the way I think. And then everything goes to hell. But that said, the religious right, you know, I've gone over a lot of their victories tonight, but there have been a lot of defeats, and not just the very brief defeat in Texas, but, you know, the New Hampshire law, I think is a good example of, you know, the breast cancer abortion link. That was a really horrific law that nobody seemed to be paying attention to until people started agitating about it online, and those people started calling their representatives. And, you know, the representatives in Congress are generally still a minority that want these things pushed through. So you can actually make a difference. And think about gay marriage in New York. That was insane, you guys. It came down to a couple of votes, and one of the votes came from my district, actually, in Buffalo. And so, you know, I got on the phone and I called our senator, and the woman answering the phone was just like, I said, you know, I'm calling about the gay marriage amendment. She's like, yeah, I've been hearing from a lot of you guys today. And I'm like, well, what's it looking like? And she's like, I thought he was gonna go one way, and now he's thinking this over quite a bit. And he ended up going the opposite way that he originally went, and same-sex marriage was passed in New York. And that was thanks to an outpouring of people literally calling him. So yeah, they can ignore your emails, they can ignore your vote, but you'd be surprised when you like show up in person and hold them accountable for the things they're doing. If enough people do that, yeah, like I hate to sound like this idealistic goofball, but I guess I kind of am, because I have seen it happen. We just need enough people to go ahead and do it, and it'll snowball. So, and you know, the religious right, I want to say one huge victory that we've had against the religious right in the past few years is simply the phrase war on women. I mean, that's a phrase that I think probably most of you have heard before tonight, the Republican war on women. Up until 2 years ago, the GOP owned words. They were the experts at it. The Democrats sucked at it. But the GOP were experts at choosing a phrase and getting it everywhere, on every show, you know, in every interview, in every newspaper. They would push out this phrase like John Kerry Swift boating, you know, things like that. They were experts at it. And this is the first time in a really long time that the Democrats got a win in the media. The war on women has become such an obvious and like inarguable thing. Like a lot of women and men understand that the GOP is not fighting for them anymore. And that's thanks to social media, that's thanks to pressure, that's thanks to people supporting people like Planned Parenthood who are pushing this idea of a war on women. And so just having that sort of meme out there is huge. So yeah, I mean, they might seem like small victories, but they're there, and I think that people are getting fed up. When you look at surveys, people are starting to notice what the GOP is doing. They've become very obvious about it. And the more obvious they've become, the more people are standing up and fighting back. So, I have my mom saying things to me like, can you believe, my mom has no political opinions at all. And so to have somebody like her suddenly saying to me, can you believe that they did this? Like the fact that she's paying attention and getting involved, that really says something to me. So apolitical people getting involved is huge. Because, most people don't vote. No, maybe not most. I don't know what the most recent figures are. But yeah, so if you can't be optimistic, fake it, is my, put on the smile until it's true. Because the more optimistic you pretend to be, the more optimistic the people around you will be, and eventually it will work. People will actually band together and start actually doing shit. Any other, I think you had, yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you thought that the recent push to get more STEM curriculum in schools, especially for young girls, might in a decade or so give us more of an audience for these kinds of talks and the votership that we're looking for here.
Yeah, if you couldn't hear the question, she's asking if the push to get more girls interested in STEM might help with understanding of issues like this and interest in it. I think that it could be one part of it. I think that it's a bigger problem than just introducing and encouraging girls in science and math at an early age. I think that what we need is an overall upgrade in people's scientific literacy. And that's people who have no interest in pursuing a career or anything in science and technology and engineering and math. We need artists and actors and historians. We need everybody to become more skeptical thinkers, to become better critical thinkers, to have that kind of skeptical toolbox, we call it. When somebody tells you something, the information should roll through your head in a certain way that goes through all of these different red flag checks before you actually believe it. And I think that is what's going to change things. And unfortunately, I think it's a bigger problem with a much more difficult solution than just focusing on STEM. I do, obviously I absolutely support encouraging girls and young women to pursue STEM careers and to just be interested in it in general. But yeah, I think that overall, kids have like this natural bullshit detection inside of them, and it's really kind of wonderful to see them working out things when they're young, figuring out. Like, I love lying to kids. That's one of my favorite things, to just like tell them I'm a vampire and be like, "What? Obviously, aren't you a vampire?" Just rolling it around in their head, and you're not a vampire. I love seeing that happen in their heads, and I think somehow we beat that out of kids somewhere, like, I don't know, in the teen years or maybe by college. And I think that the solution is encouraging more scientific literacy in general. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about one of our newest sister sites, School of Doubt. And if any of you have any interest in teaching at any level and you are interested in injecting critical thinking into your class, please check it out, because there are people on there who are teaching, music theory, English, and there are ample opportunities to talk about critical thinking and skepticism in those ways. And I think that that's what's important, is to realize that the scientific method and scientific thinking isn't just relegated to science class. It's something that we should all do every day, constantly, to live a better life.
Yeah, so as you're no doubt aware, there's been this big push from within the skeptic community supporting sort of like the same things that the religious right is advocating, like the whole like men's rights like type of stuff. How do you think we should counter that?
Yeah, if you couldn't hear, he's saying that there is a push from within the skeptical community that is agitating against women's rights and feminism and in favor of men's rights, which if you haven't heard of it, you might not realize it's the same sort of misnomer as like white rights. You can sort of substitute them. So yeah, how do we address that? How do we fight that? I think that those people tend to marginalize themselves and will continue doing so. Overall, you know, I mean, these are the same people who are, you know, they're the YouTube commenters that you shouldn't read. And so, yeah, those people share some of the same values. And, you know, that was really difficult for me coming into this as a skeptic, first and foremost, as somebody who was interested in science education. It was difficult for me to realize that there are people out there who also like Neil deGrasse Tyson and also like astrophysics, but also think that women are biologically inferior to men. But yeah, I do think that those people will be marginalized because ultimately, you know, the reason why they have become so prominent is because we've been talking more about women's rights in the skeptical movement. And one of the reasons why I first started talking about that was because I wanted more people to be skeptical. If not to actually call themselves skeptics, to at least use critical thinking. And I thought that one of the best ways to do that is to talk about not just Bigfoot. You know, Bigfoot is a lot of fun, and you know, it can attract a certain type of person to get involved in skepticism, and that's great. But there are a lot of people out there who have bigger problems than Bigfoot. They're dealing with, you know, their rights being taken away, whether through abortion access or stop and frisk laws in New York. You know, marginalized people don't have the time or interest in talking about being skeptical of something that doesn't ultimately really matter to them. So that's why I like talking about social justice in terms of science and skepticism, because I think it's a good way to get people interested in science and critical thinking in a way that will benefit them and others in their community and sort of get them involved. So at the same time, we have people who are doing the opposite of that, people who are saying, no, women are, you know, biologically inferior to men, stupider than men, or just should put up with having their boobs grabbed at our meetings. These people are, you know, by definition, going to marginalize themselves. They are, by definition, driving people away. They will attract the occasional, you know, misogynist, it happens, but they can go have their own little misogyny party over there while the rest of us continue to grow and share critical thinking on a larger stage. And I think that that's happening. You know, I think it's unfortunate that women in this community still have to put up with, you know, if you do what I do, you have to expect rape threats. Like, that's just something that you're gonna get from people who call themselves skeptics and atheists and secularists. And that's unfortunate, but it's something that we're moving beyond. So, any other questions? Does nobody want to know what James Marsters is like? Am I the only? He was